I'll birth you as many sons as you want. That's what an obese Amish girl begged a virgin mountain man on a freezing night in the Colorado wilderness. The church bell tolls in the distance. Snow whips across the mountains. A frightened girl flees her father's cruel bargain, stumbling into the shack of a man who has sworn never to love, never to fight, and never to hope again. He gives her food, but outside, wagon wheels crunch in the snow. Her pursuers are coming, ready to drag her back as property. What starts as a desperate plea soon shakes the whole town. Gossip in the church pews, a rancher's ruthless claim, and a courtroom where a single word can decide her fate. But when illness strikes and her life hangs by a thread, the virgin mountain man must face his darkest vow: protect without violence, love without fear, and fight for a family he never thought he'd have. Will mercy and faith be enough to save them, or will the past tear them apart before their love can take root? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The winter wind howled outside the line shack's walls, rattling the wooden shutters. Inside, the crackling fire cast dancing shadows across rough-hewn logs. Miriam huddled closer to the warmth, her sodden shawl dripping onto the plank floor. Her large frame trembled as much from fear as from cold. Elijah stood by the crude table, his tall figure casting a long shadow. His calloused hands worked methodically, breaking a loaf of brown bread into chunks. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the pop and hiss of burning pine logs. "Here." His voice was soft, almost shy, as he offered her a tin cup of steaming broth. "It ain't much, but it'll warm you some." Miriam's fingers shook as she accepted the cup. The rich smell of rabbit stew made her stomach clench with hunger. She hadn't eaten since fleeing before dawn, when she'd overheard her father's conversation with Tate Harlan. "Much obliged," she whispered, ducking her head. The memory of that morning rose up like bitter bile. Her father's voice, worn thin with worry over mounting debts. Tate's oily laugh as he'd proposed his solution. He'd clear the debt in exchange for taking Miriam as his wife. No, not wife. Property. Elijah settled onto a rough-hewn stool, keeping a respectful distance. His movements were careful, as if afraid of startling her. "You're welcome to dry yourself by the fire, miss. Storm's got a mean bite tonight." Miriam clutched the warm cup tighter, studying him through lowered lashes. His face was weathered but young, perhaps late 20s, with kind eyes that avoided direct contact. Nothing like Tate's predatory stare. Her desperate words from moments ago hung in the air between them. "I'll birth you as many sons as you want. Just don't send me back." Heat that had nothing to do with the fire flooded her cheeks. What must he think of her? An unmarried Amish girl, alone, offering herself so boldly. But desperation had stripped away propriety. Better to throw herself on this stranger's mercy than submit to Tate's cruel bargain. "I know it ain't proper," she said softly, "me being here like this, but I couldn't." Her voice caught. "I couldn't let them trade me like cattle." Elijah's hand stilled on the bread he was breaking. "No man has the right to trade another soul," he said, his quiet voice carrying conviction. "Not for any price." Relief weakened her knees. She sank deeper into the chair, sipping the broth. It was rich with herbs she didn't recognize. Mountain plants, perhaps? The warmth spread through her chest, easing some of the day's terrible tension. "I can work," she offered, needing him to understand she wasn't seeking charity. "I can cook, clean, mend. I'm strong, despite—" She gestured vaguely at her size, shame coloring her words. "I won't be a burden." "You ain't a burden," Elijah said firmly. He seemed to struggle with his next words. "But you should know, I live alone for a reason. Haven't been around folks much since." He trailed off, pain flickering across his features. "Since I was a boy." Miriam watched as he unconsciously touched a worn Bible that lay on the table. The leather cover was cracked and faded, but well cared for. Like her own father's Bible, before debt and desperation had twisted his faith into something unrecognizable. "I understand if you want me to leave come morning, she said, though the thought of facing Tate's men made her stomach clench. "I don't mean to disrupt your peace." Elijah shook his head slowly. "Storms likely to last days wouldn't be Christian to turn you out." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But that offer you made, about sons, you don't need to. That ain't why I'm helping." Fresh tears pricked Miriam's eyes at his gentleness. "And thank you," she whispered. The fire popped, sending sparks up the stone chimney. Outside, the wind's moan rose to a shriek, then subsided. Elijah rose and added another log to the flames, his movements deliberate and quiet. "There's a bedroll in the corner," he said, not looking at her. "I'll sleep by the fire. Come morning, we can figure what's best." Miriam wanted to protest. It was his bed, after all. But exhaustion was pulling her down like a heavy blanket. The warmth of the fire, the first real food in her belly since dawn, and the blessed relief of finding sanctuary made her eyelids droop. She must have dozed, for when she next opened her eyes, the fire had burned lower. Through heavy lids, she saw Elijah kneeling by the hearth, his head bowed. His lips moved in silent prayer, but his expression was troubled. The firelight caught the furrows in his brow, the tension in his shoulders. Guilt squeezed her heart. Her presence had brought disorder to his carefully ordered solitude. Yet what choice had she had? Tate Harlan's face rose in her mind, his cold eyes assessing her like a piece of livestock, his casual cruelty as he'd discussed the arrangement with her father. "Lord," she prayed silently, pulling the borrowed blanket closer, "I know I've broken your ways by running, by coming here unchaperoned, by speaking so boldly to a stranger. But surely you don't mean for your daughters to be sold like cattle. Surely there's mercy even for one like me." The fire crackled softly. Across the room, Elijah's prayers continued, his massive frame somehow gentle in the dim light. Despite her fears, despite the uncertainty of tomorrow, Miriam felt safer than she had in months. She drifted into exhausted sleep as the storm raged outside, while inside, an unlikely guardian kept his quiet vigil. In the deepest part of night, Miriam stirred briefly. Through half-closed eyes, she saw Elijah still by the fire, his Bible open on his knee. His whispered words reached her. "Lord, give me wisdom. Show me the path of mercy." The wind howled against the cabin walls, but inside peace held sway. Tomorrow would bring its own trials. But for now, two lonely souls had found unexpected sanctuary in the storm. Elijah's troubled expression reflected his inner turmoil. After years of choosing solitude, of avoiding the complications and potential violence of human connection, this young woman's arrival forced him to confront his carefully constructed isolation. Her desperate plea for protection stirred something he'd thought long buried, a desire to help, to protect, to be more than just a silent observer of life. The memory of his family's death in that senseless feud rose up, threatening to overwhelm him. He'd sworn then never to raise a weapon again, never to risk bringing violence to those he cared for. But turning away someone in genuine need, wouldn't that be its own kind of violence? His calloused fingers traced the worn pages of his Bible, seeking guidance. The fire's warmth couldn't quite reach the cold knot of fear in his chest. Taking in this girl meant taking on her troubles too. Tate Harlan wasn't known for letting go of what he considered his property. And her father, would he come searching with the law on his side? Yet as Elijah glanced at Miriam's sleeping form, he saw not a burden but a fellow soul seeking refuge. Her earlier words echoed in his mind. "I won't be a burden." Such dignity in the face of desperation, such willingness to work and contribute despite her circumstance. The storm continued its assault on the cabin, but inside, the fire held steady. Elijah added another log, careful not to wake his unexpected guest. As the flames caught, he remembered his mother's words from long ago. "The Lord often sends us challenges wrapped as blessings, son, and blessings wrapped as challenges." He settled back, Bible in hand, to continue his vigil. Whatever tomorrow might bring, for tonight at least, he could offer sanctuary. The rest would be in God's hands. As the night deepened, the fire's glow illuminated two solitary figures, one sleeping in trust, one watching in protective uncertainty, while outside, The Colorado winter raged on, as if testing the strength of their unlikely alliance. Dawn crept over the Colorado foothills, painting the snow-laden pines in soft rose and gold. Inside the line shack, Miriam stirred from her makeshift bed, muscles aching from yesterday's desperate flight. She found Elijah already awake, stoking the fire with practiced movements. The mountain man's broad shoulders were tense, as if he carried an invisible weight. "Thank you," Miriam said softly, smoothing her rumpled dress, "for taking me in last night. I know it wasn't proper." Elijah nodded without turning, giving her time to collect herself. The morning light filtering through the cabin's single window revealed the Spartan nature of his dwelling. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with preserves and dried herbs. Everything neat, orderly, speaking of a solitary life carefully maintained. "There's coffee," he said, his voice gentle despite its deep rumble, "and some cornbread from yesterday." Miriam wrapped her shawl tighter, gathering courage. "I should explain about why I came." She settled into a chair, hands clasped tight in her lap. "My father, he made a bargain with Tate Harlan to clear his debts." Elijah finally turned, his dark eyes serious. "The cattle rancher?" "Yes," Miriam's voice trembled. "Father owes him money, more than we could ever pay with the farm failing. So Tate offered a trade. He'd clear the debt if..." She swallowed hard. "If father gave me to him. As a wife." The word wife hung bitter in the air. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, listening. "I know what people see when they look at me," Miriam continued, shame coloring her cheeks. "I'm not slim and pretty like other girls. The work, the heavy lifting since Ma died, it's marked me, made me big, ungainly." Tears threatened, but she forced them back. "Tate, he laughed about it. Said a big girl would bear strong sons, like I was one of his prized cows." "No man should speak of God's children that way," Elijah said quietly, but there was steel beneath his gentle tone. "Father used to protect me," Miriam whispered. "Used to say our worth comes from the Lord, not men's judgment. But the drought, the debts, they changed him. Now he sees me as a burden, a way to pay what he owes." She wiped her eyes with trembling fingers. "So I ran. I couldn't bear to be sold." Elijah moved to the stove, pouring coffee into tin cups. His movements were measured, thoughtful. "You can rest here today," he said finally. "Gather your strength." Relief flooded Miriam's face. "I'm grateful. I'll earn my keep, I promise." While Elijah headed outside to chop wood, Miriam surveyed the cabin's interior with determined eyes. Though neat, the space could use a woman's touch. She found a worn broom in the corner and began sweeping, her movements awkward in the confined space. Her size made her careful, afraid of knocking things over, but she pressed on. She scraped together a meal from the meager stores, beans simmering with dried herbs, cornbread warmed on the stove. Through the window, she watched Elijah's steady rhythm with the axe, his broad back swinging in practiced arcs. The sound of splitting wood echoed across the snowy clearing. As evening approached, Elijah returned, stamping snow from his boots. His eyes widened slightly at the swept floor, the bubbling pot, the tidied shelves. But his words, when they came, were heavy with regret. "You can't stay long," he said, settling into his chair. "Folk round here, they talk. Rumors spread fast as wildfire, destroy reputations quicker than that." Miriam's face fell, though she'd known this moment would come. "I understand," she said softly. "You've shown me more kindness than I had any right to expect." They ate their simple supper by lantern light, the flames casting dancing shadows on the log walls. The beans were plain but hot, the cornbread filling. Neither spoke much, each lost in their own thoughts about what tomorrow might bring. The crunch of wagon wheels on snow shattered their quiet meal. Elijah stiffened, his hand moving instantly to dim the lantern. "Get back," he whispered, motioning Miriam toward the darker corner of the cabin, behind the shelf. Hoofbeats accompanied the wagon now, multiple horses by the sound. Miriam's heart thundered in her chest as voices carried through the cold night air. "Miriam," her father's voice, harsh with anger, "Girl, we know you're in there. Come out now, girl." Tate Harlan's deeper voice held a note of cruel amusement. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Boots crunched on packed snow approaching the cabin. Miriam pressed herself deeper into the shadows, trembling. Elijah stood by the door, his massive frame taut with tension. His right hand gripped the doorframe so hard his knuckles showed white in the dim light. The pounding on the door made the whole cabin shudder. "Open up," Tate bellowed. "You're harboring my property." Elijah's face twisted at the word property. His left hand moved unconsciously toward the rifle mounted above the door, then stopped, remembering his vow. The memory of his family's deaths in that long-ago feud rose up like a ghost, choking him with familiar guilt and grief. But Miriam's terrified breathing behind him demanded action. He'd sworn never to raise a weapon again, never to bring violence to those around him. Yet standing aside now, letting these men take her, wouldn't that be its own kind of violence? The pounding continued, punctuated by threats and curses. Elijah stood frozen between his past and present, between his vow of peace and his duty to protect. The choice pressed down on him like a physical weight as angry voices filled the night air. "You've got no right to keep her," Miriam's father shouted. "She's promised to Tate fair and square." "Last chance," Tate's voice held dangerous promise. "Open this door or we'll open it ourselves." Elijah's shoulders straightened, decision crystallizing in his mind. He'd found his faith again in silence and solitude. But what good was faith if it didn't serve justice? His vow had been against needless violence, not against protecting the innocent. The pounding grew louder, more insistent. Behind him, Miriam whimpered softly in the darkness. Elijah took a deep breath, preparing to face whatever came through that door. His hands might have forsworn violence, but his spirit had not forsworn courage. The door shuddered in its frame as Miriam's pursuers continued their assault. The choice that had seemed so clear in daylight, maintaining his solitude, avoiding conflict, now felt like ash in Elijah's mouth. The girl had trusted him, sought sanctuary in her desperation. He could not, would not, betray that trust. Elijah drew a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. Without a word to Miriam, he unlatched the door and stepped out into the snowy night, pulling it firmly closed behind him. The lantern light from inside caught the steam of his breath in the frigid air. 3 men sat astride their horses while a 4th remained at the reins of a wagon. Tate Harlan's massive black stallion pawed the ground, reflecting its master's impatience. Beside him, Miriam's father hunched in his saddle, face drawn with anger and something else. Shame, perhaps. "Evening, gentlemen," Elijah said quietly, his voice carrying in the still night air. He kept his hands loose at his sides, making no move toward the rifle they surely knew hung just inside. Tate's lip curled in a sneer. "Where is she? The girl belongs to me. Her father signed a legal debt bond." He pulled a folded paper from his coat, waving it like a flag. "She's my property now, same as any head of cattle." Inside the cabin, Miriam pressed closer to the wall, her heart pounding so hard she feared they might hear it. The crude comparison to livestock made her stomach clench. "A person ain't property," Elijah replied, his tone mild but firm. "Not in the eyes of the law, and certainly not in the eyes of the Lord." "Don't you dare preach at me, mountain man," Tate spat. "This here's a legal matter between me and Jacob Stoltzfus. You're harboring what's mine." Elijah shifted his weight, boots crunching in the snow. "This cabin and the surrounding 40 acres are my property, deeded and registered with the county. You gentlemen are trespassing." "You threatening us?" One of Tate's men reached for his gun belt. "Statement of fact," Elijah said calmly. "Sheriff Morton takes a dim view of armed men threatening homesteaders on their own land, especially after sunset." Tate's face darkened. "You think that badge-wearing fool scares me? I own half the county council?" "Maybe so," Elijah conceded. "But right now you're breaking the law. Your choice is simple. Ride away peaceful-like, or face the consequences when I report this visit tomorrow morning." The night air crackled with tension. Miriam held her breath, pressing her hands together in silent prayer. Her father hadn't spoken a word, but she could see him shifting uncomfortably in his saddle. After what felt like hours, Tate spat into the snow. "This ain't over, mountain man. We'll be back with the law on our side. That girl's coming with us one way or another." He yanked his horse's head around. "Mount up!" The riders wheeled their horses, snow flying from thundering hooves. The wagon creaked as it turned, following them down the trail. Soon only the sound of winter wind remained. Elijah's shoulders sagged as he watched them disappear into the darkness. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the door, evidence of how much the confrontation had cost him. Inside, Miriam stood in the middle of the cabin, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I never meant to bring trouble to your door. You've been so kind, and now—" "Don't fret yourself about it," Elijah cut in gently. "What's done is done." He moved to the stove, adding another log, though the fire didn't truly need it. The familiar task helped steady his hands. "But they'll come back," Miriam said, wringing her hands, "with the sheriff, maybe a judge. They'll make me go with them." Fresh tears spilled. "Maybe I should just leave now. Spare you the trouble?" "No." Elijah's voice was firm. "Night's no time for traveling, especially in this weather. You're safe here for now. We'll face tomorrow when it comes." Miriam wiped her eyes with her apron, trying to gather herself. "Thank you. I don't deserve such kindness, but thank you." Elijah only nodded, settling into his chair by the stove. "Try to rest. Morning comes early." But rest proved elusive for both of them. Miriam tossed on her pallet near the fire, finally falling into troubled sleep. In her dreams, rough hands dragged her through endless snow, while Tate's laughter echoed all around. She whimpered, thrashing against the blanket. Elijah sat in his chair through the long hours, watching over her. Each time she cried out, he added wood to the stove, though the cabin was already warm. His lips moved in silent prayer, asking for guidance, for wisdom, for the strength to do what was right. "Lord," he whispered, "show me the path. I swore never to bring violence again, but I can't stand idle while evil men prey on the helpless." He rubbed his face, remembering his family, gone these 10 years in that senseless feud. "Help me find a way through this that honors both my vow and your command to protect the innocent." Dawn crept in slowly, painting the cabin walls with pale winter light. Miriam finally slept peacefully, exhausted by fear and grief. Elijah had just started coffee when he heard horses passing on the trail. Careful not to wake Miriam, he stepped outside. Tom Wheeler, his nearest neighbor, rode past, leading a string of pack horses. The older man pulled up, nodding significantly. "Morning, Elijah. Quite a stir in town already, folks saying you've taken in Jacob Stoltzfus's girl?" Wheeler's weathered face showed concern. "Tate Harlan's making noise about it to anyone who will listen." Elijah's heart sank, though he'd expected nothing less. "Truth will out," he said simply. Wheeler scratched his beard. "Reckon so. Just thought you should know. Tongues are wagging. Might want to think on what you'll do when the law comes calling." He gathered his reins. "Good day to you." Elijah watched him ride away, stomach tight with worry. The gossip would spread like wildfire through the small community. By nightfall, everyone within 20 miles would know Miriam was here. Through the cabin window, he could see her still sleeping, face finally peaceful. Whatever came next, he knew he couldn't send her back to Tate's cruel custody, but the price of protecting her might be higher than either of them imagined. The morning sun climbed higher, promising another clear, cold day. Elijah stood for a long moment, watching his breath steam in the air, weighing choices and consequences. Finally, he turned back to the cabin. There was work to be done, preparations to make. Whatever storms gathered on the horizon, they would face them together. Morning light filtered through frost-etched windows as Elijah hitched his sturdy mare to the wood sled. The temperature had risen enough to make the trip into town manageable, though clouds on the horizon promised more snow by nightfall. He adjusted the horse blanket across the wooden bench, making it as comfortable as possible. Miriam emerged from the cabin wrapped in her shawl, her breath visible in the cold air. She had spent extra time trying to make herself presentable, smoothing her hair and dress despite her limited means. Her eyes darted nervously as she approached the sled. "You sure about this?" she asked, twisting her hands together. "Maybe I should stay here while you go alone." Elijah shook his head as he offered his hand to help her up. "Hiding will only make the talk worse. Better to face it straight on." His large palm steadied her as she clambered onto the bench, her cheeks flushed from both cold and effort. The sled runners creaked as they set off down the snow-packed trail. Miriam sat stiffly, hands folded in her lap, while Elijah guided the horse with gentle clicks and rein adjustments. The morning silence stretched between them, broken only by the jingling of harness bells and the whisper of wind through pine boughs. As they descended toward town, thin wisps of wood smoke rose from scattered chimneys. A few early risers were already about their morning tasks. Heads turned as the sled passed, conversations pausing mid-sentence. Miriam felt the weight of stares pressing against her back. "They're all looking at us," she whispered, shrinking closer to Elijah's solid presence. "Let them look," he replied quietly, though his jaw tightened. "We've nothing to be ashamed of." The general store's weather-worn sign came into view as they rounded the last bend. Several wagons were already hitched outside, their owners gathered in small clusters that dissolved as Elijah brought the sled to a halt. Whispers followed them up the wooden steps. The store bell jingled as they entered. Old Mr. Peterson looked up from his ledger, his spectacles sliding down his nose. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of them together, but he managed a polite nod. "Morning, Elijah, Miss Stoltzfus," he cleared his throat. "What can I get for you today?" "Need flour and lard," Elijah said, his voice carefully neutral. "Coffee too, if you've got any fresh in." While Mr. Peterson gathered their supplies, Miriam stayed close to Elijah's elbow, trying to ignore the sideways glances from other customers. She could hear fragments of whispered conversations. Living together? Unmarried? That poor girl. What would her father think? The store's bell chimed again. Reverend Matthews stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. His keen eyes took in the scene, and his expression grew grave. He moved purposefully toward them, his black coat adding to his air of authority. "Brother Boone," he said quietly. "Might I have a word?" Elijah nodded, though reluctance showed in the set of his shoulders. They moved to a quiet corner near the seed displays, leaving Miriam to wait anxiously by the counter. "I understand you're giving shelter to Miss Stoltzfus," the preacher began, keeping his voice low but firm. "While your Christian charity does you credit, surely you must see how this arrangement appears to others." Elijah's hands tightened on his hat brim. "She needed help, I couldn't turn her away." "No one suggests you should have," Reverend Matthews said. "But an unmarried woman living under a bachelor's roof." He shook his head. "It's not proper, Elijah. You know that. Both your reputations will suffer if this continues." Miriam could hear enough to make out the preacher's meaning. Her cheeks burned as she stared at the floor, wishing it would open and swallow her whole. She had brought scandal to the one person who had shown her true kindness. "What would you have me do?" Elijah asked, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "Turn her out? Send her back to be traded like cattle?" The preacher sighed. "There are other solutions. The widow Carson often takes in young women who need shelter. Or," he paused meaningfully, "there are more permanent arrangements that could be made, with proper ceremonies and witnesses." Elijah said nothing, but his face showed the weight of the preacher's words. After a long moment, he nodded stiffly and returned to where Miriam waited. Without meeting her eyes, he paid for their supplies and carried the packages out to the sled. The return journey passed in heavy silence. Miriam huddled beneath the horse blanket, stealing glances at Elijah's profile. His expression remained unreadable as he guided the horse homeward, but tension radiated from his rigid posture. Snow began falling as they reached the cabin, fat flakes that promised to deepen the existing drifts. Elijah carried in their supplies while Miriam stood uncertainly by the stove, wanting to help but unsure of her welcome. Finally, gathering her courage, she spoke. I could make supper, if you'd like." Her voice quavered slightly. "I know how to bake bread, at least." Elijah paused in hanging up his coat. After a moment, he nodded. "That would be kind of you." Miriam set to work with determination, though her hands shook as she measured flour into the wooden bowl. She had always found comfort in baking, in the familiar rhythms of kneading and shaping dough. Her movements were clumsy in the unfamiliar kitchen, but gradually the cabin filled with the warm scent of rising bread. Elijah worked outside, chopping more firewood despite the growing storm. The steady thunk of his axe provided a counterpoint to Miriam's domestic efforts. When he finally came in, snow dusting his shoulders, the bread was just coming out of the oven. "It smells good," he said quietly, warming his hands by the stove. "Thank you," Miriam replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She served him a thick slice spread with butter, watching anxiously as he took a bite. "It's very good," he said. And though his voice was still subdued, the praise brought color to her cheeks. They ate in silence, each lost in their own thoughts as darkness gathered outside and snow continued to fall. The wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows and driving smoky gusts down the chimney. Their isolation felt more complete with each passing hour. After the dishes were cleared away, Miriam stood by the window, watching snow spiral past in the lantern light. Her reflection showed pale and uncertain in the darkened glass. "Will you send me away?" she asked finally, her voice small but steady. Elijah didn't answer immediately. He rose from his chair and crossed to the wood box, selecting a thick log which he placed carefully on the fire. Sparks rose up the chimney as he adjusted it with the poker, his movements deliberate and measured. The fire crackled in the stillness. Outside, the storm's voice rose and fell, while inside the question hung between them like smoke. Elijah remained by the stove, his broad shoulders bowed as if under an invisible weight. Miriam waited, hardly daring to breathe for an answer that could change both their lives forever. The snow fell thicker now, piling against the cabin walls and drifting across the window panes. Each passing moment seemed to increase their isolation from the world beyond, leaving them alone with choices that could no longer be postponed. Days melted into one another as the snow continued to fall. The world beyond the cabin seemed to fade away, leaving Miriam and Elijah in a quiet realm of their own. Morning light filtered through frost-covered windows, casting pale shadows across the wooden floor where Miriam sat cross-legged, needle flashing as she mended one of Elijah's worn shirts. "These splits need tending," she said softly, holding up the rough garment. "The cold will bite right through if we don't patch them proper." Elijah glanced up from where he was banking the morning fire. "Been meaning to see to those," he admitted. "Never was much good with needlework." "Let me show you what I can do," Miriam offered, her fingers already working the thread with practiced ease. Though her hands were thick, they moved with surprising grace through the familiar motions. Later that morning, Elijah took her outside to teach her about splitting kindling. The axe felt awkward and heavy in her hands, but she was determined to learn. Her breath clouded in the frigid air as she positioned a piece of wood on the chopping block. "Like this?" she asked, adjusting her grip as he had shown her. "A bit wider with your stance," Elijah instructed, his voice gentle. "Helps keep your balance." Miriam's first few attempts glanced off the wood, barely making a mark. Her arms trembled with the effort, and sweat dampened her collar despite the cold. But she persisted, remembering all the times others had dismissed her as too clumsy, too heavy to be of use. "There," Elijah said as she finally split a piece cleanly. "You're getting the way of it now." The praise, simple as it was, warmed her more than any fire could. She worked until her muscles screamed for rest, managing to split enough kindling to fill a small basket. Though exhausted, pride straightened her spine as she carried it inside. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Miriam found herself speaking of the life she'd left behind. The words spilled out like water from a broken dam, telling of strict rules and stricter judgments, of whispered comments about her size, of prayers that seemed to go unanswered. "I tried so hard to be what they wanted," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "To eat less, work harder, be smaller somehow. But nothing ever changed." She stared into the flames, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Sometimes I wonder if God made me this way as punishment for some sin I don't even know about." Elijah was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. "The Lord I know doesn't work that way," he said finally. "He makes each of us according to his purpose, not to punish." Miriam blinked back tears at his gentle tone. "Your God seems kinder than the one I grew up with." "Maybe we just need to learn to see him different," Elijah suggested. Something in his voice made her look up, catching a glimpse of old pain in his eyes. "Did you always believe that?" she asked carefully. Elijah's hands tightened on his Bible, thumb running over its worn leather cover. "No," he admitted. "Lost my faith for a spell after my folks were killed. Thought God had abandoned us." "What happened to them?" Miriam asked softly, though part of her feared the answer. "Frontier feud," he said, the words coming slow and heavy. Neighbors fighting over water rights. Started with harsh words, ended with bullets. He paused, drawing a deep breath. I was 15. Found them both when I came in from checking trap lines. Oh, Elijah, Miriam breathed, her heart aching for the boy he had been. Swore then I'd never raise a weapon against another soul, he continued. Couldn't bear to add more violence to the world. Folks hereabouts think me strange for it, but... He shrugged, leaving the thought unfinished. They sat in companionable silence after that, each lost in their own memories. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf called to the moon. Days passed this way, filled with small tasks and quiet conversations. Miriam learned the rhythm of cabin life, when to bank the fire, how to wash clothes in melted snow, which floorboards creaked underfoot. She took pride in keeping things orderly, though her movements were still sometimes awkward in the small space. One evening, while putting away the few dishes from supper, she noticed an old harmonica lying on a shelf. Dust had settled on its tarnished surface, speaking of long disuse. Do you play? She asked, gesturing toward the instrument. Elijah shook his head. Was my paws, never learned myself. Miriam picked it up carefully, wiping it clean with her apron. We weren't allowed many instruments in our community, she said, but I learned a few hymns on one like this. A friend taught me, secret-like. She raised the harmonica to her lips, hesitating for a moment before beginning to play. The first notes were uncertain, but gradually, a familiar tune emerged. Amazing Grace, played soft and sweet in the evening quiet. Elijah sat very still, listening as the music filled the cabin. When the last note faded away, he cleared his throat roughly. That was... He paused, searching for words. Having you here, Miriam, it's been a blessing. Didn't realize how lonely this place was until you brought such sweetness to it. Miriam ducked her head, vision blurring with unshed tears. No one had ever called her presence a blessing before. She clutched the harmonica tightly, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The peaceful moment shattered the next morning with the arrival of a courier, his horse's hooves breaking through the crusty snow. Elijah met him at the door, taking the official-looking envelope with a grim expression. Miriam watched from near the stove as he broke the seal and unfolded the paper inside. His face darkened as he read, jaw tightening visibly. What is it? She asked, though fear already coiled in her stomach. Elijah looked up, his eyes troubled. It's from Tate, he said heavily. He's petitioned the county judge, demanding your return as property rightfully his through your father's debt bond. Miriam's knees weakened and she grabbed the back of a chair for support. No, she whispered. Please, no. We're summoned to appear before the judge, Elijah continued, voice tight with controlled anger. At the next thaw, when the road's clear enough for travel. The paper trembled slightly in his strong hands, the only outward sign of his emotion. Miriam sank into the chair, her earlier joy turned to ashes. She had known Tate wouldn't give up easily, but the legal weight of his claim terrified her. What? She had to stop and wet her lips before continuing. What will happen? We'll fight it, Elijah said firmly. I won't let him take you back against your will. Not while I draw breath. But they both knew it wouldn't be simple. The law often favored men like Tate, men with money and influence, men who saw others as property to be bought and sold. The battle ahead would test them both in ways they had hoped to avoid. Outside, snow continued to fall, but its peaceful beauty now seemed threatening rather than protective. Soon it would melt, forcing them to face the world beyond their quiet sanctuary. Miriam shivered, despite the warmth of the stove, and wrapped her arms tightly around herself. Elijah moved to stand beside her chair, one hand coming to rest gently on her shoulder. They stayed that way for a long moment, drawing strength from each other's presence, while the letter lay on the table between them like a shadow of storms to come. The snow's fierce grip finally loosened its hold on the mountain, softening under pale winter sunlight. Patches of brown earth emerged between drifts, and icicles dripped steadily from the cabin's eaves. The change brought both relief and anxiety. Travel would soon be possible again, forcing them to face what waited in town. Elijah stood in the doorway early Sunday morning, studying the rutted path that led down to the valley. His shoulders tensed as he turned back inside. "Reckon we can make it to service today," he said quietly. "Snow's packed enough for the sled." Miriam looked up from where she was tidying the breakfast dishes, her hands stilling on a tin plate. "Are you certain that's wise?" she asked, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. "Best to face them straight on," Elijah replied, though his own voice held little confidence. "Hiding away only feeds the gossip." They prepared in nervous silence. Miriam donned her cleanest dress, still wrinkled from their flight, and smoothed her hair beneath her bonnet. Elijah put on his one good shirt, carefully brushing dust from the worn fabric. Outside, the morning air bit sharp and clean. Elijah harnessed his elderly mule to the wooden sled, while Miriam wrapped herself in an extra blanket. The runners creaked as they started down the mountain, the mule picking its way carefully over the rutted snow. "Whatever happens," Elijah said suddenly, breaking the quiet, "hold your head high. You've done nothing to be ashamed of." Miriam clutched the blanket tighter, grateful for his words even as doubt gnawed at her heart. The little white church came into view all too soon, its steeple stark against the winter sky. Several wagons and sleds already clustered around it, and people in their Sunday best filed through its doors. The whispers started the moment they entered the church. Miriam felt the weight of every stare, heard the hushed conversations that fell silent as they passed. Her face burned, but she kept her eyes forward, following Elijah to an empty pew near the back. They sat close together, though propriety demanded a proper space between them. Miriam found herself unable to focus on the sermon, too aware of the sideways glances and meaningful looks being exchanged throughout the congregation. She noticed Mrs. Peterson, the banker's wife, lean over to whisper something to her neighbor while staring directly at them. Elijah sat straight back beside her, his expression carved from stone, but she saw how his hands clenched white-knuckled on his Bible. The service seemed to stretch endlessly, every hymn and prayer a test of endurance under the weight of judgment. When the final amen was spoken, most of the congregation lingered, clearly hoping to witness any drama that might unfold. Elijah touched Miriam's arm lightly. "Wait here," he murmured, then strode purposefully toward the preacher, who was speaking with deacons near the pulpit. Miriam watched anxiously as Elijah drew the preacher aside, their heads bent in serious conversation. Though she couldn't hear their words, she saw the growing concern on both men's faces. "Reverend," Elijah said in a low voice, "I need your counsel. Tate Harlan's laid legal claim to Miriam through her father's debt bond. Will the law favor him?" The preacher's weathered face grew grave. "I've seen the bond myself. It's properly witnessed and filed with the county. Unless there's stronger legal protection." He hesitated, glancing toward Miriam. "Well, a wife cannot be claimed as payment for another's debt. Marriage would void Tate's claim entirely." Miriam, who had drawn closer without realizing it, gasped softly at these words. Both men turned, finding her standing just behind them, her face flushed with emotion. "I'm sorry, child," the preacher said gently. "I wish I had better news, but Tate has influence with the judge, and frontier law can be harsh where property rights are concerned." "She's not property," Elijah ground out, his quiet voice carrying an edge of steel. "No," the preacher agreed, "but you'll need the law's protection to prove it." He gripped Elijah's shoulder briefly. "Pray on it, both of you. The Lord will guide your path." The ride home was silent, each lost in their own thoughts as the sled runners whispered over snow. The afternoon light was fading by the time they reached the cabin, casting long shadows across the white ground. That evening, after a simple supper neither could truly eat, Miriam knelt beside her pallet near the fire. Her voice trembled as she began to pray aloud. "Dear Lord," she whispered, "I know I'm not worthy of asking favors. I've brought trouble to this good man's door, and shame follows wherever I go." Tears slid down her cheeks. "But please, Father, show me the way. I'm so afraid, and I don't know what to do." Elijah stood motionless in the shadows, listening as she poured out her heart. Her words struck deep, echoing his own struggles. He had sworn to live alone after his family's death, believing isolation would keep him from more pain. But watching Miriam pray, seeing her faith despite her fears, stirred something long dormant in his soul. The night passed slowly, Elijah sat in his chair long after Miriam had fallen into troubled sleep, wrestling with his thoughts. The fire burned low, casting flickering light across the cabin's rough-hewn walls. Outside, an owl called mournfully into the darkness. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, Elijah rose. He had not slept, but his mind was clear at last. Miriam stirred at his movement, sitting up and drawing her shawl close. "Miriam," he said softly, meeting her eyes across the dim room. "There's only one way to keep you safe from Tate's claim." He paused, gathering his courage. "We must marry." Miriam's eyes widened, her hands clutching her shawl tighter. "But we barely know each other," she stammered. "I know you're kind," Elijah said. "I know you work hard and pray honest. I know you deserve better than being traded like cattle." He moved closer, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the early light. "I can't offer much, just this cabin and my protection. But I swear before God to be a faithful husband and treat you with respect." Tears spilled down Miriam's cheeks as she looked up at him. "You would do this? Take me as I am, knowing all my faults?" "We all have faults," Elijah said gently. "The Lord sees past them to what's in our hearts." Miriam's breath hitched on a sob. "Yes," she whispered, "yes, I will marry you." Elijah held out his hand, and she placed her trembling fingers in his broad palm. They stood that way in the firelight, both nervous and reverent, as morning painted the eastern sky in delicate shades of pearl and gold. No words of love were spoken. This was a marriage born of necessity and honor rather than passion. But as they clasped hands in the quiet cabin, something deeper than romance passed between them. A solemn promise to face whatever came together, bound by faith and trust in each other's goodness. The moment stretched, filled with unspoken hopes and fears. Then Elijah carefully released her hand, turning to bank the fire for the day ahead. There would be arrangements to make, preparations for a simple ceremony. But for now they simply shared the peace of the morning, each drawing strength from the other's presence as dawn brightened into day. The town's small wooden church stood quietly in the pale morning light, frost glittering on its weathered boards. Inside, rough-hewn pews filled quickly as townsfolk arrived, their breath visible in the chilly air, despite the pot-bellied stove burning in the corner. The preacher's wife had decorated the altar with pine boughs and a few precious winter berries, their red spots bright against the green. Elijah stood at the front, his tall frame uncomfortable in his best shirt, which still showed signs of Miriam's careful mending. His hands, usually so steady with axe or saw, trembled slightly as he adjusted his collar. The preacher gave him an encouraging nod from where he stood ready with his Bible. A murmur rippled through the congregation as Miriam appeared in the doorway. She wore a dress of brown homespun, carefully cleaned and pressed, with a bit of white lace collar she'd saved from her Amish days. Though simple, the dress had been let out with careful stitching to fit her fuller figure. Her cheeks were pink with cold and emotion as she made her way down the narrow aisle. Mrs. Peterson leaned toward her neighbor, whispering behind her hand, "Hardly proper, this hasty wedding, and her in that plain dress instead of white." But old Widow Jenkins, sitting nearby, smiled warmly at Miriam as she passed. "Hush now," the widow said firmly. "There's more ways than one to make a proper marriage." Miriam kept her eyes forward, though she heard the whispers. When she reached Elijah's side, she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. His expression was solemn, but his eyes held gentleness as he looked down at her. The preacher cleared his throat and opened his Bible. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying to the rafters, "we are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The familiar words filled the church, speaking of duty and devotion, of God's blessing on the union of two hearts. Miriam's hands shook as she held the small bunch of dried flowers the preacher's wife had given her. Beside her, Elijah stood straight and tall, though she could sense his tension. When it came time for the vows, Elijah's deep voice faltered at first. I, Elijah Boone." He paused, swallowing hard, then continued with growing strength. "Take thee, Miriam Stoltzfus, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward." The words seemed to steady him, as if their ancient weight gave him courage. By the end, his voice rang clear and true through the church. "Until death do us part, according to God's holy ordinance, and thereto I pledge thee my faith." Miriam's response was soft but unwavering, her Pennsylvania Dutch accent lending music to the familiar phrases. When she promised to love, honor, and obey, tears sparkled in her eyes, but she smiled through them. The preacher nodded approvingly. "What God hath joined together, let no man put asunder. By the authority vested in me, I now pronounce you man and wife." He paused, then added gently, "You may kiss your bride." Elijah bent awkwardly, placing the briefest of kisses on Miriam's cheek. Her face flamed, but she managed to keep her composure as they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife. The preacher's wife had prepared a simple meal in their small house next to the church. Bread still warm from the oven, preserved peaches, and a modest cake decorated with pine sprigs. The few guests who attended, mostly church elders and their wives, spoke quietly of the weather and the winter's severity, politely avoiding mention of the unusual circumstances that had brought about the marriage. Miriam sat at the table, barely tasting the food, overwhelmed by the strange reality of being a wife. Elijah stood nearby, making awkward conversation with the preacher about spring planting plans. His shoulders gradually relaxed as the afternoon wore on, though his eyes often strayed to Miriam as if reassuring himself of her presence. As the winter sun began to set, they prepared to leave. The preacher's wife pressed a small package into Miriam's hands, leftover cake wrapped in clean cloth, and embraced her warmly. "God bless your home, child," she whispered. "You've got a good man there." The journey back to the cabin seemed both longer and shorter than usual. The mules' hooves made soft thumping sounds in the snow, and their breath frosted in the gathering dusk. Neither spoke much, each lost in thought about what lay ahead. When they reached the cabin, Elijah helped Miriam down from the sled, then saw to the mules' care while she went inside to light the lamps and stoke the fire. The familiar tasks felt strange now, weighted with new meaning. This wasn't just Elijah's cabin anymore, it was meant to be their home. The evening stretched before them, awkward and uncertain. Miriam moved about the cabin, trying to keep her hands busy. She spread her quilts on the narrow bed, then hesitated, looking at Elijah's sleeping roll still rolled up in the corner. "I'll make up your bed here by the fire," she said softly, reaching for the bedroll. "No." Elijah's voice was firm but gentle. "You take the bed. I'll sleep here by the stove. It needs tending through the night anyway." "But," Miriam twisted her hands in her skirt, "we're married now, shouldn't we?" "There's time enough for that," Elijah said quietly. "Let's not rush what we don't feel ready for." Relief and something like disappointment mingled in Miriam's chest. She nodded, turning away to hide the tears that suddenly threatened. Later, lying in the narrow bed, Miriam listened to Elijah moving quietly around the cabin, banking the fire for the night. Tears slid silently down her cheeks. Tears of gratitude for his gentleness. Tears of fear for their uncertain future. Tears of joy at having a safe place to call home at last. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered into the darkness, "for bringing me to this good man's door." On his bedroll near the stove, Elijah lay awake long into the night, listening to Miriam's soft breathing across the room. The enormity of what they'd done weighed heavily on his mind. He'd sworn once never to take on responsibility for another life after failing to protect his family. Now he had a wife to care for, to protect, to provide for. "Lord," he prayed silently, "show me if I've chosen rightly. Give me strength to be the husband she needs." He paused, then added, "And help me learn to open my heart again." The cabin creaked softly in the cold night air. Outside, snow began to fall, adding another layer of white to the world. Inside, two people who had been strangers just weeks ago lay awake, each wondering what tomorrow would bring. Each hoping they had found in the other something worth building a life around. The fire popped and settled in the stove, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Elijah rose quietly to add another log, his movements careful not to disturb Miriam. As he lay back down, he heard her shift in the bed, and then her soft voice came through the darkness. "Good night, husband." "Good night," he answered after a moment. "Wife." The simple words hung in the air between them, strange yet comforting, as the night deepened around the little cabin and its two inhabitants, now bound together by more than mere necessity. The morning after their wedding dawned crisp and bright. Sunlight sparkled on fresh snow outside the cabin windows as Miriam stirred from sleep. For a moment, she lay still, remembering. She was a wife now. The thought both thrilled and frightened her. Across the room, Elijah was already up, quietly stoking the stove. The familiar scent of coffee filled the cabin. He nodded to her as she sat up, his movements careful, as if trying not to startle a wild creature. "Sleep well?" he asked softly. "Yes, thank you." Miriam smoothed her hair, suddenly conscious of her rumpled appearance. I'll make breakfast." She busied herself with cornmeal and the last of their dried apples, grateful for something to do with her hands. The porridge bubbled thick and fragrant, steam rising in the cool morning air. As she stirred, she snuck glances at Elijah, still marveling that this quiet giant of a man was now her husband. The days that followed settled into a gentle rhythm. Miriam threw herself into domestic tasks, determined to prove her worth. Her first attempts at sourdough bread were heavy as rocks, but Elijah ate them without complaint. By the fourth try, the loaves rose properly, filling the cabin with their yeasty aroma. "Now that's proper bread," Elijah said, breaking off a warm chunk. His praise, though simple, made Miriam's heart swell. Between household chores, she worked on piecing quilts from scraps the preacher's wife had given her. The familiar task soothed her nerves, each careful stitch a prayer for their future. Sometimes she sang softly as she worked, old hymns from her Amish childhood that seemed to fit the peaceful solitude of their mountain home. Elijah, watching her bent over her work one afternoon, cleared his throat. "Time you learned some mountain ways," he said. "Can't stay inside all winter." And so began her education in frontier skills. Elijah showed her how to strap on snowshoes, the leather bindings strange against her heavy boots. Her first steps were awkward, spreading her legs wide to accommodate the wooden frames. "I look like a duck," she said, face flushed with effort and embarrassment. "A very determined duck," Elijah replied, and the unexpected touch of humor in his voice made her laugh out loud. The sound of their shared laughter rang across the snowy ridge, startling them both. Miriam couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed so freely. From the look on Elijah's face, neither could he. He taught her to set rabbit snares, his big hands gentle as they showed her how to loop the wire. "Like this," he demonstrated. "Rabbits are creatures of habit. They'll use the same paths over and over." Miriam's first successful trap yielded a plump snowshoe hare. "We'll eat well tonight," Elijah said approvingly as he showed her how to clean it. Instead of being squeamish, Miriam took pride in the task. This was survival, not waste. Their suppers grew more companionable. The initial awkward silences gave way to quiet conversation. One evening, stirring a pot of beans, Miriam found herself speaking of things she'd never told anyone. "I've always been big," she said softly, eyes on the fire. "Even as a child, the other girls, they were all slim and quick. I was the one who could lift hay bales and move water barrels, but never the one chosen for games or singing." She swallowed hard. "When Papa made that bargain with Tate, he said at least my size would mean I could bear strong sons." The words hung in the air like smoke. Elijah was silent so long she thought he hadn't heard. Then his deep voice came quietly across the table. "I see your heart, Miriam, not your size." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You're kind, strong in spirit. That matters more than how you look." Miriam ducked her head, but not before Elijah caught the glow of joy that transformed her face. She ladled beans into his bowl with hands that trembled slightly. They developed small rituals. Every morning, Elijah brought in fresh water and wood before Miriam rose. Every evening, she made sure his socks were dried by the fire for the next day. They learned to move around each other in the small cabin space, no longer apologizing for every accidental brush of shoulders or hands. But shadows lingered at the edges of their growing contentment. Word reached them through occasional visitors that tongues were wagging in town. Some said Elijah had been forced into marriage by the preacher. Others whispered that Miriam was already carrying his child when she arrived. The gossip stung, though neither spoke of it directly. Darker than gossip was the knowledge that Tate hadn't given up his claim. He was seen often at the county seat, speaking with lawyers and the judge. His figure seemed to loom in the background of their days like a storm cloud on the horizon. One bitter afternoon, a rider fought his way through deep snow to deliver a message. Elijah read it by the window, his face growing grave. Miriam watched him, her hands stilling on the quilt in her lap. "The court date is set," he said finally. "First week of spring thaw." He looked up at her, his eyes troubled. "Tate's pressing his claim through your father's debt bond." Miriam's fingers clenched in the fabric. All the old fear came rushing back. Fear of being treated as property. Fear of being torn from this place that had become home. Fear of losing Elijah just when she was learning to love him. That evening, the beans seemed tasteless despite Miriam's careful seasoning. The lamplight cast long shadows on the walls as they ate in heavy silence. Finally, Elijah reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused against her skin. "I want you to know something," he said, his voice low but firm. "No matter what happens in that courthouse, I'll stand by you. You're my wife now, proper and legal. I won't let them take you back to that life." Miriam's vision blurred with tears. She gripped his hand tightly, not trusting herself to speak. Finally, she managed to whisper, "Thank you." The word seemed too small to hold all she felt. Gratitude for his protection, joy at his acceptance, hope for their future. But Elijah seemed to understand. He squeezed her hand once before letting go, and they finished their meal in a silence that felt more like peace than fear. Later, as Miriam banked the fire for the night, she watched Elijah preparing his bedroll near the stove. Though they were married now, he had kept his word about not rushing things between them. His patience and respect had done more to heal her wounded spirit than any words could have. "Good night, husband," she said softly, the word still new enough to bring a blush to her cheeks. "Good night, wife," he answered. And though his face remained serious, there was warmth in his voice that made her smile as she climbed into bed. Outside, the wind sang through pine branches heavy with snow. Inside, two people who had been strangers weeks ago lay awake in the darkness, each thinking of the other, each wondering what spring would bring. But for now, in this moment, they had found something precious. A shared home, a growing trust, and the first tender shoots of love taking root in winter soil. The January cold bit deeper as winter tightened its grip on the mountain. Snow lay thick around the line shack, transforming the landscape into endless waves of white. Inside, Miriam and Elijah had settled into a comfortable routine, their initial awkwardness giving way to quiet companionship. One crisp morning, while Elijah prepared for his daily wood chopping, Miriam stood from her quilting with determination in her eyes. "I want to help," she announced, reaching for her shawl. Elijah paused at the door, axe in hand. "The wood splitting?" "No, Miriam. It's too cold out there." "I'm stronger than I look," she insisted, wrapping the thick wool around her shoulders. "And I won't learn by watching from the window." Her chin lifted in that stubborn way he'd come to recognize. Elijah hesitated, studying her face. The past weeks had brought color to her cheeks and confidence to her bearing. Still, the memory of her desperate arrival that stormy night made him protective. "The axe is heavy," he warned, "and the work is hard." Miriam laughed, the sound bright in the winter quiet. "I've done hard work all my life, husband." She stepped past him into the snow, her boots crunching firmly. "Show me how." Elijah followed, shaking his head but smiling despite himself. At the chopping block, Miriam lifted the axe with determination. Her first swing went wide, barely grazing the log. The second struck awkwardly, the blade sticking. "Here," Elijah said, moving behind her, "like this," or his large hands covered hers on the axe handle, showing her the proper grip. "Keep your feet apart for balance. Let the weight of the axe do the work." For a moment they stood close together, their breath mingling in white clouds. Elijah was suddenly very aware of her warmth against him, the softness of her hair near his chin. He guided her through the motion slowly, demonstrating the rhythm of the swing. The axe bit deep into the log, splitting it cleanly. Miriam's delighted laugh echoed across the snow-covered yard. "We did it." "You did it," Elijah corrected, stepping back. His hands felt strangely empty without hers beneath them. They worked together through the morning, Miriam's swings becoming more confident, though still unpracticed. Her face glowed with effort and accomplishment. Even when her arms began to tire, she insisted on continuing until they had a decent pile of split wood. "Enough," Elijah finally said, seeing her breath coming harder. "We've done good work today." Miriam nodded, leaning on the axe handle. "Thank you for teaching me," she said softly, "for not treating me like I'm made of glass." Before Elijah could respond, a gust of wind cut through the clearing, carrying the first flakes of new snow. The sky had darkened while they worked, heavy clouds promising more to come. "Storm's coming," he said, gathering the split wood. "We'd best get inside and tend to the mule before it hits." They hurried to stack the wood by the cabin. Miriam insisted on feeding the mule herself while Elijah secured the barn doors against the rising wind. By the time she came back inside, the storm was howling in earnest, driving snow horizontal across the windows. Elijah looked up from stoking the fire when he heard her cough, a deep rattling sound that seemed to come from her chest. Miriam waved off his concern, but her cheeks had lost their healthy color. "Just the cold air," she said, but coughed again, harder this time. Elijah put the kettle on, adding extra wood to the stove. "I'll make you some tea with honey." His mother's remedy for winter ailments came back to him as he worked. Willow bark for fever, dried mint for chest congestion. But Miriam's cough grew worse through the afternoon, and by evening heat radiated from her skin. "I'm fine," she protested weakly when he felt her forehead. "Just need to rest a bit." But her eyes were too bright, and her breathing had grown labored. Fear gripped Elijah's heart as he watched her shiver despite the blankets he piled on their bed. He knew little about treating serious illness. His years of solitude hadn't prepared him for this. When Miriam began mumbling in her fever sleep, calling out in Pennsylvania Dutch, he knew he had to act. "I'm going for the doctor," he told her, though he wasn't sure she heard him through the fever. "Hold on, Miriam. Please hold on." The storm raged as Elijah saddled his most sure-footed horse. Snow stung his face, and the wind tried to tear him from the saddle. But he pressed on. The 4-mile ride to town seemed endless. Twice, the horse nearly lost its footing in deep drifts, and Elijah's prayers became desperate whispers lost in the howling night. He found Dr. Matthews at home, thankfully. The older man took one look at Elijah's face and began packing his medical bag without question. The ride back was even slower, the doctor's buggy struggling through the deepening snow. Every minute felt like an hour to Elijah, his mind filled with images of Miriam alone and suffering. When they finally reached the cabin, Miriam's breathing had grown worse. Dr. Matthews examined her thoroughly while Elijah hovered nearby, reading every shift in the physician's expression. "Her heart is weak," the doctor finally said, straightening up with a grave look. "Years of heavy work and poor nutrition have taken their toll. This fever, combined with the strain of physical labor and such cold." He shook his head. "She shouldn't be chopping wood or doing heavy tasks, especially not in this weather." Guilt crashed over Elijah like an icy wave. Will she recover? The doctor packed away his stethoscope slowly. "She's young, which helps, but another hard winter like this one could kill her. Her heart simply can't take the strain." He handed Elijah a packet of powders. "Mix these with water for the fever. Keep her warm and quiet. No exertion until the fever breaks. I'll try to check on her in a few days, weather permitting." After the doctor left, Elijah sat beside the bed, watching Miriam's labored breathing. Her face was flushed with fever, her hair dark with sweat against the pillow. He took her hand, so different from that morning when they'd laughed together over the woodpile. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice rough. "I'm so sorry, Miriam. I should have protected you better." His free hand clenched into a fist. "Should never have let you strain yourself." Through the night, he tended her carefully, spooning water and medicine between her cracked lips, bathing her face with cool cloths. His prayers, so long abandoned after his family's death, came haltingly at first, then with growing urgency. "Lord, don't take her," he pleaded in the darkest hours before dawn. "I'm just learning to be a proper husband, just learning to care for someone again. Please, give us more time." Miriam stirred, mumbling words he couldn't understand. Elijah held her hand tighter, remembering how she'd awakened his dormant faith with her simple grace, her quiet strength. The thought of losing her now, when their life together had barely begun, was unbearable. "Fight, Miriam," he whispered. "You're the strongest person I know. Fight to stay with me." The blizzard raged on outside, but Elijah kept his vigil, counting each labored breath, praying for morning light to bring some change. In those long hours, he faced a truth he'd been avoiding. Somewhere between pity and protection, he had begun to love his unexpected wife. For 3 days and nights, the blizzard raged outside the cabin while Miriam burned with fever inside. Elijah moved through the hours like a man in a dream, sleeping only in short bursts when exhaustion overcame him. He kept the fire stoked high, melting snow for fresh water and brewing endless pots of willow bark tea. Miriam drifted between restless sleep and delirium, sometimes calling out in Pennsylvania Dutch, other times lying so still that Elijah had to lean close to make sure she was still breathing. Her face, usually so full of life, had grown pale and drawn, dark circles shadowing her eyes. "Just a little more," he would whisper, supporting her head while helping her sip weak broth. His large hands, used to rough work, grew gentle with practice as he spooned the liquid carefully between her cracked lips. Most of it dribbled down her chin at first, but he patiently wiped it away, trying again and again until she managed to swallow a few spoonfuls. In the endless quiet hours broken only by the howling wind and Miriam's labored breathing, Elijah found himself humming old hymns his mother had sung. His voice was rough from disuse, cracking on the high notes, but he kept on, remembering how Miriam had played those same tunes on his harmonica just days ago. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound," he sang softly, the words coming back to him from childhood. "That saved a wretch like me." His voice caught on the last word. He had been a wretch indeed, turning his back on faith after losing his family, believing himself cursed to eternal solitude. Now, watching Miriam struggle for each breath, he felt the weight of his old vow pressing down on him. He had sworn never to love again, never to risk that soul-crushing loss. Yet here he sat, his heart clenching with fear every time Miriam's breathing grew more labored, unable to deny that somehow, without his permission, love had crept in. "I once was lost, but now am found," he continued singing, his voice thick with emotion. "Was blind, but now I see." Through the night he sang every hymn he could remember, his cracked voice filling the cabin with wavering praise. When the words failed him, he hummed the melodies, watching Miriam's face for any sign of improvement. Sometimes her lips would move slightly as if trying to join in, though no sound came out. On the fourth morning, as weak winter light filtered through the frosted windows, Elijah found himself at the end of his strength. The doctor hadn't been able to return through the storm, and Miriam's fever still burned hot. Dark thoughts plagued him. What if she didn't recover? What if God was punishing him for his years of faithlessness by taking her away? Unable to bear it any longer, Elijah sank to his knees beside the bed. His shoulders shook as he pressed his forehead against the rough quilts. "Lord," he whispered, then stopped, overwhelmed by the strangeness of praying aloud after so many years of silence. But Miriam's labored breathing urged him on. "Lord, I know I turned my back on you. I was angry and hurt and afraid. I thought I could live without faith, without love. But I was wrong." Tears fell freely now, soaking into the quilt. "Please don't take her from me. Not when I'm just learning to live again. Not when she's shown me there's still goodness in this world." His voice broke. "I'll do anything. I'll be the husband she deserves. I'll rebuild your temple in my heart. Just please, please let her live." The morning light strengthened as he prayed, spilling across the cabin floor in golden strips. Elijah poured out years of buried grief and anger, confessing his failures, his fears, his growing love for the woman who had stumbled into his life like an answer to prayers he hadn't known he was making. "Thank you." The whisper was so faint he almost missed it. Elijah raised his head to find Miriam's eyes open, watching him with tired clarity. Her hand moved slightly on the quilt, reaching for his. "For what?" he asked hoarsely, taking her hand as if it were made of glass. "For the hymns," she whispered, "for staying, for praying." Each word seemed to cost her great effort, but her fingers tightened weakly around his. "Save your strength," he said, his heart pounding with hope as he felt her forehead. The burning heat of fever had lessened slightly. Throughout that day, Elijah watched anxiously as Miriam drifted in and out of sleep, but her breathing grew easier. He coaxed more broth into her, and by evening, she managed to swallow several spoonfuls without choking. The fever continued to fade, degree by precious degree. When dawn broke the next day, Miriam's fever had broken completely. She was weak as a newborn colt, but her eyes were clear when they met his. "Think you could sit up a bit?" Elijah asked, already moving to support her shoulders. "Might help you breathe easier." Together, they managed to prop her up against the pillows. Miriam's face was drawn with exhaustion from even that small effort, but she smiled faintly at him. The sight hit Elijah like sunshine breaking through storm clouds, warming places in his heart he'd thought frozen forever. He kept hold of her hand, marveling at how perfectly it fit in his despite their difference in size. The quiet that settled between them was comfortable, full of unspoken understanding. "I thought," Miriam began, then had to stop to catch her breath. "I thought I heard you singing." Elijah ducked his head, embarrassed. "Wasn't much singing, more like croaking." "It was beautiful," she insisted softly. "Reminded me of home, of better times." "You'll have better times again," he promised, "once you're stronger." Miriam's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry to be such a burden, first hiding me from Tate, then nursing me through fever." "No." Elijah's voice was firm as he squeezed her hand. "Listen to me, Miriam. You're not a burden. You never were." He took a deep breath, gathering courage for words he needed to say. "When you first came, I took you in out of duty. Married you to protect you, but now—" He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. "Now I want to protect you because you're my wife, my beloved wife. Not from obligation, but from love." Miriam's tears spilled over, wetting his hand where it cradled her face. "Even though she gestured weakly at herself. "You're beautiful," he said simply. "Your heart, your spirit, your kindness, everything about you is beautiful to me." A sob caught in Miriam's throat, and Elijah quickly helped her take a sip of water. "Easy now," he soothed. "We have time, all the time in the world for me to show you how precious you are." They sat together as evening settled over the cabin, holding hands in the peaceful quiet. The storm had passed, outside and within, leaving behind a landscape transformed by new snow and new love. Elijah felt the presence of God in that silence, a blessing settling over them like a warm blanket. Miriam's eyes grew heavy, but she fought to keep them open, as if afraid this moment would disappear if she slept. Elijah smoothed her hair back from her forehead, his touch gentle. "Rest," he told her. "I'll be right here when you wake." "Promise?" she murmured, already drifting. "I promise," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere, beloved." As Miriam slipped into healing sleep, Elijah kept his vigil beside her, his heart full of gratitude. The old vow of solitude had shattered, replaced by a new one, to cherish this unexpected gift of love for all his days. Outside a gay, the stars emerged in a clear sky, witnesses to the miracle of two hearts finding their way home through the storm. The first warm winds of spring swept through the valley, carrying the sweet promise of renewal. Snow retreated from the foothills in patches, leaving behind muddy trails and swollen streams. In the line shack, Miriam stood at the window, watching winter's grip loosen its hold on the land. Her fingers twisted nervously in her apron as she thought about the journey ahead. "The wagon's ready?" Elijah said softly from behind her. He stood in the doorway, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the wooden floor. "Are you sure you're strong enough for the trip?" Miriam turned to face him, squaring her shoulders despite the flutter of fear in her chest. "I have to be," she answered. "We can't delay the court date any longer." Elijah nodded, understanding in his eyes. The winter had been long, filled with both healing and worry. Miriam's illness had left her weaker than before, but her spirit had grown stronger with each passing day. Their love had deepened in those quiet months, built on shared prayers and gentle care. They set out at dawn the next morning, the wagon creaking beneath them as their horse picked its way carefully along the muddy trail. Elijah had packed extra blankets and warm food, ensuring Miriam would be comfortable during the day-long journey to the county seat. She sat close beside him on the wagon seat, drawing strength from his solid presence. "Whatever happens," Elijah said as they crossed the valley floor, "remember that you're my wife now. No piece of paper can change that." Miriam pressed closer to his side, grateful for the warmth of his body against the spring chill. "I know," she whispered, "but Tate..." Tate is just a man, Elijah replied firmly. A man who thinks money can buy anything. But some things aren't for sale. They traveled through the morning, stopping briefly to rest the horse and share a simple meal of bread and dried meat. Miriam noticed how Elijah's eyes constantly scanned the trail ahead and behind, watching for any sign of trouble. Though he didn't speak of it, she knew he worried Tate might try to interfere before they reached the courthouse. As the sun climbed higher, they began passing more travelers on the road. Word of the trial had spread through the territory, drawing curious onlookers from neighboring settlements. Each passing wagon brought knowing looks and whispered conversations. Miriam held her head high, though her cheeks burned with shame at being the center of such attention. They reached the county seat by early afternoon. The courthouse stood proud on the town square, its wooden steps already crowded with spectators. Elijah helped Miriam down from the wagon, supporting her with gentle hands as her legs trembled from the long ride. "Steady now," he murmured. "I'm right here." They made their way through the crowd, ignoring the whispers that followed them. Inside the courthouse, the wooden benches were packed with townspeople. Near the front, Tate sat with his lawyer, his expensive coat and polished boots speaking of wealth and influence. He turned as they entered, his lips curling in a cruel smile that made Miriam's stomach clench. The judge, a stern-faced man with iron-gray hair, called the court to order. The room fell silent as Tate's lawyer rose to present their case. He held up a weathered document, the debt bond that had started all this trouble. "Your Honor," the lawyer declared, "this legal instrument clearly shows that Jacob Stoltzfus traded his daughter's hand in marriage to settle his debts with my client. Mr. Harlan is simply seeking what is rightfully his." Miriam felt Elijah's hand tighten on hers as Tate stood, addressing the court with practiced charm. "I paid good money for this contract," he said smoothly. "A deal's a deal, Your Honor. That girl belongs to me by right of law." A murmur ran through the crowd. Miriam's heart pounded so hard she could barely breathe. But then Elijah rose slowly to his feet, his quiet presence drawing all eyes in the room. "Your Honor," he began, his voice clear and steady despite his usual reluctance to speak in public. "I ain't much for fancy words or legal papers, but I know right from wrong, and treating any person as property is wrong in the eyes of God and man." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Miriam came to me in the depths of winter, seeking shelter from a storm and from those who would harm her. We grew to care for each other, and when we learned of this bond, we chose to marry, not from fear or force, but from love." Tate's face darkened with anger. "Love?" he spat. "What does love have to do with it? I paid for her fair and square." "Silence," the judge commanded, banging his gavel. He turned to study Miriam, who sat trembling but upright. "Young woman, is what your husband says true? Did you marry of your own free will?" Miriam stood on shaky legs, drawing strength from Elijah's presence beside her. "Yes, Your Honor," she said clearly. "I chose to marry Elijah. He treated me with kindness and respect when others saw only my size and my father's debts. He is my husband in the eyes of God and by the laws of this territory." The judge nodded slowly, considering her words. The courtroom held its breath, waiting. Tate's lawyer jumped up, waving the bond again. "But, Your Honor, the contract is null and void," the judge interrupted firmly. "No contract can supersede the sacred bonds of marriage, freely entered into before God and witnesses. This court recognizes the marriage of Elijah Boone and Miriam Stoltzfus as legal and binding." He fixed Tate with a stern look. "And I suggest you think carefully before bringing such claims before this court again." Relief flooded through Miriam so strongly her knees nearly buckled. Elijah's arm went around her waist, holding her steady as always. Around them, the crowd buzzed with excitement at the verdict. Tate stood abruptly, his face twisted with rage. "This isn't over," he snarled, jabbing a finger at Elijah. "No mountain man's gonna make a fool of me. You'll regret this day, both of you." He stormed from the courthouse, his boots thundering on the wooden floor. His lawyer hurried after him, clutching his papers. But Miriam barely noticed their departure, too focused on the wonderful feeling of being truly free at last. Elijah turned to her, his eyes soft with love and pride. "Let's go home," he said simply. They made their way back through the crowd, accepting quiet congratulations from some of the townspeople. Outside, the spring sunshine felt warmer somehow, more welcoming. As Elijah helped her back into the wagon, Miriam felt hope blooming in her heart like the first flowers pushing through the melting snow. The ride home was peaceful, filled with comfortable silence and shared glances. They had faced their first real test as husband and wife, and their bond had proven stronger than any paper contract. As the familiar shape of their mountain came into view, Miriam reached for Elijah's hand. "Thank you," she said softly, "for standing up for me, for seeing me as a person, not property." Elijah squeezed her hand gently. "You don't need to thank me for doing what's right," he replied. "Besides, you're the one who showed real courage today." The sun was setting as they reached their cabin, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Spring winds rustled through the awakening trees, carrying the promise of new beginnings. Together, they climbed down from the wagon, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, not as protector and protected, but as true partners, bound by love and choice rather than obligation. The wagon wheels creaked as Elijah guided their horse down the muddy main street. Spring sunshine warmed their faces, so different from the bitter cold of that first desperate night when Miriam had stumbled to his door. She sat close beside him on the wagon seat, her shoulder pressed against his arm, drawing comfort from his steady presence. "We need supplies," Elijah said quietly, pulling the wagon to a stop in front of Whitaker's general store. "Might as well stock up while we're in town." Miriam nodded, though her heart fluttered with uncertainty. This same store had been the site of whispers and sideways glances just weeks ago. But things were different now. The court had upheld their marriage, declaring it true and legitimate before God and man. Elijah climbed down first, then reached up to help Miriam. His strong hands steadied her as she stepped carefully from the wagon, her legs still shaky from the long ride and the emotional strain of the trial. Without hesitation, he offered his arm and she took it gratefully. The bell above the store door chimed as they entered. Mrs. Whitaker looked up from behind the counter, and to Miriam's surprise, a genuine smile spread across the older woman's face. "Well, if it isn't the Boones," she said warmly. "We heard about the trial. Congratulations to you both." Miriam felt her cheeks flush with pleasure at being addressed as Mrs. Boone so naturally. "Thank you kindly," she murmured. Other customers in the store turned to look, but instead of the usual judgment in their eyes, Miriam saw something new, respect and even approval. Sarah Jensen, the banker's wife who had once pulled her skirts aside when passing Miriam on the street, now stepped forward with an outstretched hand. "That was brave, standing up to Tate Harlan like that," she said. "Both of you. This town's better for having folks who will stand for what's right." Elijah ducked his head modestly, but Miriam saw the pride in his eyes as he thanked her. They moved through the store, selecting flour, coffee, sugar, and other necessities. At each turn, they met friendly nods and quiet congratulations from their neighbors. Reverend Matthews entered as they were paying for their goods. He paused to shake Elijah's hand firmly. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said, his eyes twinkling. "Sometimes he uses the most unexpected circumstances to bring two hearts together." "That he does, Reverend," Elijah agreed softly, his hand finding Miriam's again. The ride home seemed lighter somehow despite the heavy load of supplies in the wagon bed. Spring birds called from the greening trees, and fresh buds dotted the branches. Miriam breathed deeply, savoring the sweet air and the feeling of belonging that wrapped around her like a warm shawl. When they reached the cabin, Elijah began unloading their purchases while Miriam hurried inside. The familiar sight of their modest home filled her with joy. The rough-hewn table where they shared meals, the rocking chair where she sat to mend, the bed they had yet to share but which represented their future together. "I want to make something special for supper," she called to Elijah as he carried in the last of the supplies. "To celebrate." He paused in the doorway, a soft smile touching his lips. "You don't have to do anything fancy." "I want to," she insisted. "Would you fetch fresh water while I start the stew?" While Elijah took the bucket to the creek, Miriam busied herself in their small kitchen area. She chopped carrots and potatoes from their winter store, adding dried beef and the last of their preserved herbs. The familiar work settled her racing thoughts, helping her process the momentous events of the day. The cabin door creaked open as Elijah returned with the water. He moved quietly around her as she worked, building up the fire and setting the table. They had fallen into an easy rhythm over the past months, learning to share space and tasks without words. As the stew bubbled over the fire, rich aromas filling the cabin, Miriam found herself humming one of the hymns from her childhood. Peace settled over her like a blessing. The fear that had been her constant companion since fleeing her father's house had finally lifted, replaced by something warm and secure. When the meal was ready, they sat together at the table. Elijah bowed his head to say, "Grace," his deep voice steady and sure, as he thanked God for their food and for bringing them together. Miriam added her own silent prayer of gratitude. The stew was simple but satisfying, made special by the circumstances rather than any particular skill. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire dance in the hearth. Outside, the spring evening settled softly around their mountain home, bringing with it the first calls of night birds. Finally, Miriam gathered her courage to speak the words that had been building in her heart all day. "I never thought I'd find a place where I truly belonged," she said quietly, staring into her bowl. "All my life I felt unwanted. Too big, too plain, too much of a burden." She lifted her eyes to meet Elijah's steady gaze. "But you chose me. Not because you had to, but because you wanted to." Elijah reached across the table to take her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "God brought you to my door that night," he said softly. "I was lost in my solitude, hiding from life instead of living it. You showed me there was another way." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe we both needed choosing." Tears pricked at Miriam's eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. She squeezed his hand, unable to speak past the emotion tightening her throat. After they cleared the supper dishes, they settled in their usual places. Miriam in the rocking chair with her mending, Elijah on the bench near the fire. But tonight felt different, more intimate somehow. The victory at the courthouse had changed something between them, deepening their connection beyond mere convenience or necessity. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, a gentle spring rain began to fall, drumming steadily on the roof. The sound brought back memories of that first stormy night, when a diddy spree. When the Pearl had knocked on a stranger's door, and how far they had come since then. Elijah added another log to the fire, then resumed his seat. His eyes met Miriam's across the room, full of warmth and understanding. No words were needed. Their silence was rich with shared meaning, with promises kept and trust earned. As the evening deepened into night, they remained thus content in each other's presence. The rain continued its gentle song, and the fire popped and whispered in the hearth. Here in this simple cabin, two lonely souls had found not just shelter but home, not just safety but love. Peace settled over them like a blanket, warm and secure. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together, not as protector and protected, but as true partners, chosen and cherished. The night wrapped around their mountain home full of stillness and hope. Spring warmth settled over the mountain, bringing with it the sounds of Elijah's saw and axe. Each morning, he rose before dawn, marking trees for felling, while Miriam prepared a hearty breakfast of flapjacks and coffee. The steady rhythm of his work echoed through the pines. The bite of the axe, the rasp of the saw, the heavy thud of timber meeting earth. Miriam watched from the doorway of their small shack as Elijah stripped branches from another fallen pine. His movements were sure and strong, practiced from years of solitary labor. But now his work had new purpose. Each log would help build their future together. Inside the shack, Miriam kept busy with her own preparations. She had traded eggs from their few chickens for yards of cheerful cotton print, and now she carefully stitched curtains for their windows. The fabric brightened the rough wooden walls, making the space feel more like home with each careful stitch. The changes weren't just physical. Nearly every day, someone from town passed by their property, usually bearing small gifts. Martha Jensen brought a cast-iron kettle, explaining she had a spare. Tom Wheeler from the hardware store appeared with a box of nails, claiming they were odd sizes he couldn't sell. Even quiet Sarah Peterson rode up one afternoon, a well-worn family Bible tucked in her saddlebags. "Every home needs the good book," she said simply, pressing it into Miriam's hands before riding away. Each gift represented more than its practical value. It was a sign of acceptance, of welcome into the community. Miriam placed each one carefully in their home, touching them with grateful fingers when she passed. When Sunday came, Elijah hitched their mule to the wagon while Miriam dressed in her best dress, the one she had carefully altered to fit her fuller figure. The morning was bright and clear as they rode to town, sitting close together on the wagon seat. The little church was already filling when they arrived. Heads turned as they entered, but the looks were kind now, welcoming. They took their place in a pew, and Miriam felt tears spring to her eyes when Mrs. Wheeler deliberately moved to sit beside them, patting her hand in greeting. Reverend Matthews stood to deliver his sermon, his voice carrying clearly through the sunlit church. He spoke of redemption, of how God's grace could transform the darkest valleys into places of light. His eyes met theirs more than once as he described how love could heal old wounds and create new beginnings. Miriam found herself weeping softly, overwhelmed by how far they had come from those desperate early days. Elijah's strong hand found hers, squeezing gently. She held on tightly, drawing strength from his steady presence. The ride home was peaceful, filled with comfortable silence. But when they reached the shack, Elijah helped her down from the wagon and then covered her eyes with his hands. "I have something to show you," he said softly, guiding her forward several paces. "Look there." When he dropped his hands, Miriam gasped. Before them lay neat rows of foundation stones, carefully placed to outline a much larger structure than their current home. She could see where rooms would be: a proper kitchen, a parlor, even space for bedrooms. "Oh, Elijah," she whispered, covering her mouth with trembling hands. He stood behind her, his voice gentle but sure. "It's for our future," he said. "For the family we'll raise together. Not because you asked, but because I want it too. Because God brought you to me that winter night, and now I can't imagine my life without you in it." Miriam turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. His eyes were warm and certain as he looked at her, full of love she had once thought she'd never deserve. The foundation stones stretched before them, solid and promising. Like their love, it had grown from desperate beginnings into something strong and true. Together, they would build their home, their family, their future, not from obligation, but from choice. Spring painted the mountainside with delicate colors as winter's grip finally loosened. Tiny wildflowers dotted the meadow grass, and fresh buds transformed bare branches into clouds of pale green. The warming air carried promises of new beginnings. Behind their small shack, Miriam stood with her hands on her hips, studying the patch of ground she and Elijah had cleared for a garden. The soil was rocky, but rich and dark when turned. She had traded eggs for seed packets at the general store, dreaming of fresh vegetables to supplement their simple meals. Elijah appeared beside her, two hoes balanced on his broad shoulder. "Ready to make those straight rows you've been talking about?" he asked, handing her one of the tools. Miriam nodded, determination bright in her eyes. She had explained her plan several times, neat parallel lines like she remembered from her father's farm. But as they began to work, the reality proved more challenging. The hoe felt awkward in her hands, and her first attempt wandered like a drunken snake across the plot. Elijah's deep chuckle made her pause. "Reckon those beans might get a mite dizzy trying to follow that path," he teased gently. Miriam felt her cheeks flush, but then she caught his infectious grin and started laughing too. "Well, I suppose they'll grow just as sweet in crooked rows," she admitted. Together they worked through the afternoon, Miriam carefully planting bean seeds while Elijah helped her mark spaces for herbs, rosemary, thyme, and sage. The sun warmed their backs as they labored, and the fresh-turned earth released a rich, promising scent. As evening approached, they settled into their new routine. The small porch Elijah had added became their favorite spot, with two rough-hewn chairs facing the setting sun. Miriam brought out the family Bible, its leather cover softened by years of handling. Her voice rose and fell with the ancient words while Elijah listened, his eyes closed in peaceful contemplation. The sky turned to purple velvet and the first stars appeared. Miriam's voice faltered, then fell silent. She traced the Bible's worn pages with careful fingers, gathering courage. "Elijah," she said softly, "there's something I need to say." He opened his eyes, turning to face her with patient attention. She hesitated, then pushed forward. "I dream of children, of giving you sons and daughters to fill this home we're building." Her voice caught. "But the doctor said my heart is weak. What if I can't?" Tears spilled down her cheeks as the fear that had haunted her finally found voice. Elijah rose from his chair and knelt before her, taking her trembling hands in his. "Listen to me," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You are the greatest gift God has ever given me. Whether we raise a dozen children or none at all, that won't change." He reached up to brush away her tears. "My love for you isn't based on what you can give me. It's based on who you are." Miriam broke down completely then, years of shame and worry pouring out in cleansing sobs. Elijah gathered her close, letting her cry against his chest while he stroked her hair. Her tears soaked his shirt, but he held her until the storm passed. And when she finally calmed, Elijah helped her up from the chair. "Come with me," he said softly. Hand in hand, they walked to the edge of their clearing. The night sky stretched vast above them, scattered with countless stars. They sat together on a fallen log, shoulders touching, faces turned upward to the heavens. No words were needed now. Miriam's heart felt lighter than it had in years, unburdened of its secret fear. Elijah's hand was warm and steady in hers, his love as constant as the stars above. Together they sat in peaceful silence, two souls joined by something far deeper than duty or obligation, the free gift of love, given and received in full measure. Golden wheat swayed in the late summer breeze as evening approached. The lengthening shadows stretched across the half-finished walls of Elijah and Miriam's expanding home. Though tarps still covered parts of the roof, the main room stood sturdy and welcoming, filled with the rich aroma of fresh-baked bread and simmering stew. Neighbors from nearby homesteads gathered around the long pine table Elijah had crafted. Mrs. Peterson brought preserves, while the Millers contributed late summer vegetables. Miriam's heart swelled as she ladled her thick venison stew into borrowed bowls. "This bread," exclaimed Sarah Thompson, breaking apart a warm slice. "Light as a cloud, Miriam. You must share your secret." Miriam blushed at the praise, remembering countless failed attempts before mastering the recipe. "Just patience and prayer," she answered softly, catching Elijah's proud smile from across the table. After the meal, someone suggested a hymn. Voices rose together in the familiar words of Amazing Grace. Miriam's clear soprano lifted above the others, steady and sure. Gone was the trembling shame that had once made her hesitate to sing. Her voice filled their unfinished home with joy, turning rough-hewn beams into cathedral rafters. When the last guest had departed into the deepening dusk, Miriam and Elijah stood together in the doorway. She leaned against his strong arm, watching lanterns bob away down the trail. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving me a name and place that no one can take away." Elijah drew her closer, his voice rough with emotion. "You gave me back my faith when I thought it was lost forever." He touched her cheek gently. "God knew what he was doing, sending you through that snowstorm to my door." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching stars appear in the darkening sky, their hearts full of gratitude for the blessing of belonging. Autumn painted the foothills in shades of amber and gold. Crisp morning frost sparkled on fallen leaves as Elijah hammered the last cedar shingles into place. The sound echoed across the valley, a rhythm of completion that made his heart soar. Below, Miriam sat in the morning sun, her capable hands guiding fabric through neat rows of stitching. The quilt, taking shape in her lap, bloomed with simple patterns, stars and squares in calico prints. She hummed softly while she worked, at peace with the quiet industry of preparing for winter. As evening approached, they settled together on the fresh-hewn porch steps. Smoke curled from their new brick chimney, carrying the sweet scent of pine. Miriam leaned against Elijah's shoulder, watching the sunset paint the sky in deep rose and purple. "I used to be so afraid," she whispered, her voice steady now where it once trembled. "My father turning me away, Tate treating me like property, the shame I carried about my size." She touched Elijah's rough hand. But that fear has no power anymore. Elijah's fingers tightened gently around hers. When you first came, you promised to give me sons, he said softly. But you've given me something far greater. Peace in my heart and love I never thought to find again. The evening star appeared, bright against the darkening sky. Together they rose, mounting the steps to their front door. Lamplight spilled through the windows, warming the fresh-cut wood beams overhead. The hearth glowed with a welcome, promising shelter against coming storms. They stepped across the threshold, no longer two lost souls seeking refuge, but a family bound by choice and blessed by grace. Their home stood firm, a testament to love built day by day, through storm and sunshine, until it could shelter all their dreams yet to come. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.